Okay. So you should all be able to see my PowerPoint slides. And it looks like this part of the meeting is being recorded. So for those of you who are looking for like foundational and background knowledge, I am really happy to provide that. So this is going to be creating accessible course materials for beginners. And then after I go through the slides, there will be plenty of time for questions. Um, so I think a lot of us maybe know that there's, oh, sorry. I always forget that when I screen share on Zoom, I can't go to the arrow keys right away to change slides until I've changed a slide. I don't know if that's just my computer or not. Um, so a lot of you may have been hearing a lot about accessibility, and maybe you know why, or maybe you kind of know why, but are worried you don't understand as much as you feel you should, or something like that. So if you're feeling a little bit lost, the reason you've been hearing so much about this is because Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, has some new regulations that go into effect April 24th. So that's why you've been seeing a lot of accessibility programming. And these regulations basically set a technical standard for all web and mobile content for public entities. Um, I did link to the specific standard. It's called WCAG 2.1. There are three levels of standards. We're responsible for A and AA. And WCAG is a really broadly used, like fairly universal web accessibility set of guidelines. But if you actually look at it, some of it is fairly technical, it's fairly dense and jargony, and a lot of it is something that, Canvas worries about, but your average instructor doesn't have to. So I've been telling instructors, don't worry too much about WCAG. Instead, focus on basic digital accessibility, which I'll talk more about later. Because for your average instructor, that's enough. If you are building your own apps or websites, then you'll want to dig into WCAG. But if you aren't, you can probably not worry about them. I just include the link for references. And so under regulations, because of the way they're written, it means that anything on university websites has to meet these accessibility guidelines. So crucially, that includes Canvas courses, even though they do require a login. So I've been phrasing it as accommodations aren't enough anymore. We'll still have the need for accommodations, but accessibility should be the default. So for example, if there's a video in a course, in the past, maybe sometimes you would have it captioned and sometimes you would, it would slip through the cracks and you would think, oh, but if a student needs captioning, then I can get it captioned. But now, like all of our videos will be captioned by default, just as an example. So if you are feeling like it would be helpful to kind of break the work down into steps, I've developed like this 8 steps that I'm going to go through. And then the first step has some additional slides with digital accessibility fundamentals. And that's because the first step is just assessing the situation. So you don't know where to go if you're still kind of like figuring things out. So first, just like take a deep breath. You are doing the first step by being here because part of it is learning about what you need to do and how to do it. I like to encourage people at this stage to kind of get an overview of what digital accessibility means. And that's why this first step is the one that I've bulked out a little bit. And then also look at your courses and try to kind of get an overview of the digital resources there. How many of you are familiar with like the little gas gauges on the side of something that you link to or embed in a course? I saw at least one person say yes, and then I realized I don't have the chat open. So if people are saying yes in the chat, I don't know. Okay, good. So that is a tool called Ally. And it's built into Canvas at UF. It's built into our Canvas instance. And it scans content, and then if it sees accessibility errors, it flags it for you. So that's why those gas gauges are. But you can also look at the course as a whole. So if you go to instructor tools in your course, I think it's at the bottom left. The option will be like Ally Course Report or Accessibility Course Report. And so that will give you kind of like an overview of your course accessibility, which is really nice. It it also has a couple of buttons that I really, really like. One of them is fix easiest content, and another is fix lowest scoring content. So it's really good for like distributing your workload and prioritizing things and noticing things that you might have missed. So if you haven't been using Ally and you want like one concrete action item for after this talk, I would recommend looking at your Ally course report. We do have another accessibility checker in Canvas at UF. So if you feel like you can only handle one, I would focus on Ally. But if you are open to using a couple, the other one is called You Do It. That's UDOIT, all uppercase, all one word. And that one you can enable in the course navigation. You don't find it through instructor tools. Ally is a little bit stronger with files, but I do find you do it really helpful for fixing problems on Canvas pages themselves. Ashlyn, did you have a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you for hosting this because it's been overwhelming, I think, for a lot of us faculty.
Yeah.
I'm in chemistry, and we just had Ryan Rushing come over from
Mhm.
I actually don't know which office because there were a
He's
lot
with
of
CC. I
different
know Ryan.
office names in the presentation.
Yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah, I don't know if you know him, but essentially he was telling us that the Ally in Canvas is not the gold standard, and like that there's no current tool out there that exists that can perfectly like scan any of our materials. And I was wondering if you felt similarly.
Yeah, no, I do agree with Ryan on that. So I like Ally. I use Ally all the time, and I'm absolutely not disparaging it.
Hmm.
But I think that there is sometimes an issue where people treat Ally like a compliance tool.
Mm.
When you go to the course report, it gives you a percentage. And when you work in academia, a percentage is a grade, even though it really isn't in this case. Especially because well, I'll loop back to that. So Ally is an automated checker, so it's not perfect. It I have seen it make some errors, like false positives and false negatives sometimes. Usually, the false negatives are things where it just requires human judgment to say, oh, that's not correct, even though it appears to be if you don't have the context that a human subject matter expert does. But I have seen a couple like this document does not have a title. And I was like, oh no, I really thought it did. And I downloaded it and it did have a title and I uploaded it again and still got the error. So I wouldn't focus on that percentage as like a compliance measure, but I do find Ally really useful for pointing things out and helping me like organize my remediation work.
Okay.
Does that answer the question? Does that help?
Yeah, so it kind of sounds like it's not an end all be all, but it might help alert you to something that you want to like go check essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Ally is really useful, but Ally's not the boss of you. Like you can make decisions about your own content.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. So those two tools are pretty helpful. And this is the part where I'm going to break away from like the step by step and give you some digital accessibility background because that's really helpful moving forward. And again, you want to know what these tools are looking for so that you can make decisions on what they're telling you. So, oh, again, I'm no longer in PowerPoint and have to, there we go. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be this hard for me to change slides. So when you're first starting to think about digital accessibility, remember that you're just thinking about how your content can be accessed by people with a really wide variety of needs. So, some examples are that content should be readable for people who are colorblind or who have low vision. It should also include options for audio and visual. so people who can't see or hear aren't like left out of it. It should be usable for people who need assistive technology. And the four main types of assistive technology I give as examples, it's not limited to this. There are plenty of others. But the examples I usually give are screen readers. So someone who is blind and can't see the screen would be likely to use software that's reading the screen out and like voicing the content. There's also voice control software, which is kind of cool. It lets you use your voice to tell the computer like what to click on, what to type. So that's for people with limited or no hand mobility. Then there are immersive readers for people with various print disabilities. So somebody with dyslexia might be using an immersive reader, and that might have some read aloud functionality, but it can also distinguish parts of speech and break down content in ways to make it easier to like process the reading if your brain doesn't automatically do that. And then screen magnifiers, they just make the screen look bigger. It's like a big zoom lens. Um, yeah. And then the other two things that content should be considering are whether it demonstrates clear and consistent organization for cognitive accessibility. And then this last one, I always throw in because it's helpful to be aware of. But if you're like creating a document, it's not something you need to worry about. But there are plenty of people who rely on the keyboard and can't use a mouse. That includes most screen reader users, but also other people who might just have mobility issues or other things going on. So again, if you're like making a document, you don't need to think about mouse access or sorry, keyboard access, but it's a good thing to be aware of because as you learn about digital accessibility, it will come up. And before I move on, I have some specific tips for how to achieve these things, but first I saw something in the chat and don't want to miss it. Oh, sorry. Was it just the sign in link? All right. Sorry about that. So I have three strategies for like how you can consider these various needs. Strategy one is to focus on multimodal content. Like, as you're developing things, think about how someone who can't see or hear the content would access it. So, for example, if you have like a podcast that you want students to listen to, that's audio only content. So, someone who's deaf would need transcripts, or somebody who has like an auditory processing disorder might also need transcripts. Um, if you have a video, it needs captions though. It can also have transcripts if you want to add those, but under these guidelines, it can't only have transcripts and not captions. Now, I will say if you're like in a situation where you're remediating your whole course and there's one video that you haven't been able to caption yet and you're working on it and you want to put a transcript there in the meantime as like a stepping stone, I would still recommend doing that. But the goal for videos is to always have captions. And then another thing about videos is whether you can understand them if you can't see the video, like if you don't see the visuals on the screen. So a lot of the time that's handled by an audio description track. You can find them on some streaming services. It's kind of similar to captioning, but it's for people who can't see the video instead of people who can't hear it. And it's an additional audio track that will insert verbal descriptions of the visuals on screen in natural pause points in the dialogue. So, if you are an instructor who records lectures, though, instead of waiting for an audio description track later, I always think that the best thing to do is just kind of be aware as you have visuals to briefly describe them. So if you have a chart in your slides, I would say something along the lines of like, this is a graph of, and then what it's about. You know, it's a line graph. This is the x-axis. This is the y-axis, and it generally trends up. And that's all you have to say. And then you can start really analyzing the content. It gives sighted people a chance to kind of orient themselves, and it makes sure that somebody who can't see the chart still knows what's going on. And I think it's nicer for instructors than getting an audio track because then you have control over that content and what the audio description would say. And then for static visuals like images and graphs, those need an image description or alternative text. Alternative text sounds really technical, but it's not that bad. Alternative text is metadata, which I know doesn't help make it sound less technical, that somebody who's just like looking at the content doesn't see, but a screen reader will get to that image and have the alternative text that the content creator wrote to read out loud so that somebody who can't see the image gets your description. So if you are in PowerPoint and you're adding an image and you right click on the image, one of the options is edit alt text. Same with Word. Um, in Canvas, if you embed an image, you can add alt text through Ally by clicking on the little gas gauge, or in image options. So it sounds kind of technical, but it's really just typing a couple of sentences. And you want it to just kind of convey the visuals that are important, but keep it brief. It doesn't necessarily need to go into like every detail. Like if there were a screenshot of my video right now, and for some reason it was getting posted somewhere and you needed alt text, you might say, like a woman wearing glasses with a headset. But you wouldn't need to describe like what colors I'm wearing or my background unless it's somehow relevant. So that's strategy one. Strategy two is about the use of color. And I always want to emphasize, I don't want people to leave this thinking that they're not allowed to use different colors in their presentations and their content. That's not my goal. I use color. Um, but there are two things to consider to make sure that your use of color is inclusive for everyone. One of them is to make sure that words, icons, things like that have enough contrast with the background. So that's really not so much about the color choice in terms of the hue. It's really about the value, like how dark or light it is. So this is something that you probably naturally do a lot of anyway. If you have a light background, you're using dark text and vice versa. Um, Sometimes, though, there are colors that are a little borderline, and if you're not thinking about it, you would just assume that it's fine. But then if you actually look at a color contrast checker, it's like not quite dark enough or not quite light enough. Um, and so I'll send these slides to John after the meeting so he can distribute them to you. But this link goes to a contrast checker because the web accessibility standards I mentioned earlier do have a specific like ratio of how dark to light things should be. But I don't even bother memorizing the ratio because numbers don't stick well in my head. So I just use a color contrast checker and I let the internet remember it for me. And then I don't have to guess and I don't have to remember. And it actually is very easy. And if you're using the Chrome browser with the contrast checker, um, there's an eyedropper tool. I think that the eyedropper tool is only working in Chrome, but if you use another browser, feel free to check that and let me know if it works in it. And then the other thing to consider with the use of color is actually getting into what Becky mentioned in the chat. Um, so you don't have to avoid those things necessarily, but I think what they're getting at is avoiding using color alone to convey meaning. When I first learned about digital accessibility best practices and somebody said, don't use color alone to convey meaning, I will be honest, it meant like nothing to me. I just didn't understand what that means. So I think it's helpful to give examples of what that means. If you are trying to draw attention to some words and you change the font color, that would be an example of using color alone to convey meaning because somebody who's colorblind might perceive that color as like a dark, dull brown, which doesn't look that different from the black text next to it. So it's not actually drawing their attention in. So they're missing that layer of meaning. Another example is like if you have an answer key for like a quiz a student took and the answers that I got wrong have like a red box next to them and the answers or the questions I got right have a green box. if I have red-green color blindness, which is the most common type, there are like, I think, three different types of color blindness that impact red and green. There could be more that I'm forgetting. I wouldn't know what I got right or wrong, but it's really easy to fix this issue because you can still use colors. You just want to add something in addition to the color. So if I'm trying to draw your attention to words, I might still change the font color, and then I might also make it bold, or I might make it underline, but only if I'm not worried that it will look like a link. It just kind of depends on the context. But as long as I have like those two ways of getting at that meaning, it's fine. So like for the answer key, like a green check and a red X preserves the color coding for people who find it helpful, but also has that additional layer. So don't feel like you're not allowed to use different colors. Just, keep those two things in mind. And then the third and final strategy is about making things readable for everyone. And the first thing I strongly suspect that you're already doing, you probably, when you create content, like if you're writing like longer blocks of text, for example, you're probably chunking it and organizing it for readability already. And you might be doing that by adding headings. Um, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you make font bigger to designate it as a heading, that does look like a heading to somebody like me who's sighted. I could scan that document and just look for the bigger text and get an idea of the organization of the page. But someone using assistive technology would lose that layer of meaning that's only in the font size. So instead, you can designate something as a heading programmatically, and then somebody using a screen reader can go through just the headings in the document and get that equivalent to an outline and understand the organization. And again, it sounds kind of technical and intimidating to be like, it has to be designated programmatically as a heading, that has to be in the metadata. But if you're in Microsoft Word and you like highlight text up at the top ribbon, there's like title, heading one, heading two, and then you click on one of those and you've designated it as a heading. And that will also create like the table of contents in Word, which is nice. In a Word document, you want to start with a heading one, not a title, though. I It's a long story. Um, and then don't skip heading levels. So you can have like, a few heading ones, and then the sub-content is a heading two, but you don't want to go from a heading one to a heading three, or somebody might think that they missed something by accident. And it's the same with list styles. Usually programs, if you like have an asterisk, they'll figure out pretty quickly it's a list, but just make sure that the list thing is selected and that it really is a list. And then for URLs, a lot of us are in the habit of, oh, I want to share this link with students. I copy it, I paste it, and I'm done. But if a screen reader gets to a URL, it reads the whole URL, like the whole long thing. So it can really slow people down. So instead, if you hyperlink it to text that's relevant to what the link goes to, that will be a smoother experience. And then finally, you just want to choose simple fonts. So like sans serif fonts are more readable than
Laura,
serif
I have a quick
fonts.
question, if I
Yeah,
could
this is
ask
a
you
good time for a question.
about the URLs.
Mhm,
Um, so let's say I was linking, I don't know, to the Bureau of Labor Statistics or something
mhm.
like that. When I insert, like I put, rather than putting the whole long link, should I actually say link to US Bureau of Labor Statistics, or can I, like, do I need to include that link
I
to,
am so glad you asked that question, because I suspect that a lot of people had the same one and I just forgot to think about it. You do not need link to, you just link to the words. And it's actually the same with alternative text. You do not need to start alternative text with image of or picture of. And that's because in both of those cases and with a heading, a screen reader will get to it and it will say link and then read your hyperlink text.
okay,
Or it will say image and read the alt text. So
okay,
that was a
thank
really good
you.
question. Thank you. So after this slide, I'm moving on to like more of those steps for prioritizing your workload when you're making your course accessible. But before I do that, are there other questions we have about the strategies? Okay. What time is it? I want to make sure I'm going fast enough. Okay, good. I didn't want to cut off time for questions for all of you. So after you've kind of assessed your course and learned what you feel like you need to know upfront about digital accessibility, sometimes, all right, you've been teaching a class for years. Maybe you inherited it from someone else in the first place. You've changed things over time. The file system can be really cluttered. So sometimes that can be a little bit overwhelming. It can mean that you're not sure what you need to remediate and what you don't because you don't remember, is this linked anywhere? Can students even see it? You might have a department who is kind of concerned with the ally score overall. So in all of those cases, you might be able to save yourself time by removing files that you're not using from the course. There's another tool for this in Canvas. It's called Tidy Up File Cleanup. And that one is also available through Instructor Tools. And it basically scans all your course files and it tells you if they are like linked to from a page or in a module or something like that. And if they're not, that column will be empty. So it's a good way of identifying files that you're not really using. Um, you can delete files through the tool, but I try to encourage people not to do that. A lot of files have the same name, and once you've deleted it, it's gone. So I just feel like Tidy Up is great for kind of identifying files you want to get rid of, but I feel safer deleting the actual files I want to delete from files in Canvas. Another thing about Tidy Up is that it won't tell you if like an image is linked in a quiz question, for example. So that's another reason that I just like to urge caution with it. But if you have a lot of like legacy files to get rid of, it can be a big time saver. Once you've kind of cleaned things up and you know where you're at, I think it's good to kind of build your momentum and gain confidence by fixing easy issues. And both Ally and You Do It, the two tools I mentioned earlier, have a button that will say, something along the lines of content with the easiest issues to fix, or fix easy issues, or something like that. It depends on which tool you're in. Usually that's going to be things like alternative text in Canvas, increasing color contrast, and replacing URLs with hyperlinked text. Those just tend to be the things that are on those lists. But once you've done that, it's like you've made a difference, you've made a lot of progress. And I think that that kind of is a really good starting point for getting your feet under you. After that, I think it's good practice to think about videos. And one of the reasons these are early, like there are 8 steps and it's, in the first half, is that I know sometimes re-recording videos can take a while. So it's good to know early on if there are any you need to re-record. So, as you're looking at your videos, ask yourself, can I understand the videos with the sound off if I turn on the captions? And can I understand the videos with my eyes closed? Um, and the captions sound intimidating, but again, actually, the captions shouldn't be too hard. Any video that you upload to UF's media site server, like if you have a My Media Site account or if you've recorded it with one of our studios on campus, those are getting automatically captioned, so you don't have to do anything for those, which is nice. If you notice an error in the captions, you can either request it fix through the captioning form, or you can actually fix it yourself through Canvas, which is kind of fun. Um, well, I think it's fun. Maybe my definition of fun isn't everyone's. And then also, in terms of understanding videos with your sound off, that's something that you might end up choosing 1 or 2 videos to re-record, and that's why I put this one early. Ashlyn, what's your question or comment?
Yeah, it's a question. So this makes sense to me, but I was also wondering, so I teach chemistry and
Mhm.
I do a lot of live demonstrations, but some demonstrations, instead of me doing them, I've just found some really nice videos on YouTube. And sometimes those are nicely captioned, but the captioning might not be, describing everything that is seen in the video. So I was wondering, like, am I allowed to show videos that might have like closed captioning, but it doesn't necessarily like describe that there's like a beaker that has exactly this in it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so the captioning should really only need to capture the audio.
Okay.
It's the audio that then needs to capture the visuals, if that makes sense. But think about it in terms of like if you have a student who can't hear the video, then they need to hear any dialogue, and there might also be relevant sound effects sometimes. Like if you're watching an action movie, like you'll see a sound of explosion in the captions. And then if it's something very visual, um, like how far up the beaker did they pour this chemical? I'm not a chemist, I'm so sorry.
It's
Um,
okay.
that's something that you would want to make sure is in the audio so that someone who can't see the video can understand it. So just kind of like take a look at the videos
Hmm.
and see if there are any that you want to flag as like this is a priority to replace, maybe. Does that
Yeah,
help?
it's hard because some of the videos, they're not easy for me to replicate or they're dangerous experiments, right? And so
Yeah,
I'd rather use what's already been done and not, subjugate myself or my
yeah,
class to it. But I can't control if it's a public, posted video. I can't really control what they say in their auditory, thing.
right.
So I'm like, would it suffice if as I play the video, like maybe I pause and I can explain what's happening, fill in any gaps? Like, does that count? Or is it just a moot point if it's like the video itself is not describing with words everything
Yeah.
that's happening?
So if you're playing it live in class, it's not technically covered by the regulations, but it is really good practice to, if you know that there's something that's very visual, to pause and describe it and kind of check in with the students. If it's something you're posting on Canvas, you might again like consider having a written description of some of the visuals as a stopgap measure while you're like, okay, like this is something that I might eventually replace, but I can't replicate this on my own right now, and I haven't found a better one. So this is like my kind of temporary, it's better than not, considering it.
Okay, so in class, which, oftentimes I'm kind of pausing and narrating the videos anyway, just to make sure that the whole
Yeah.
class is understanding how it's displaying a concept.
Hmm.
So in class, it's so obviously I turn on the closed captioning just in case someone's sitting in class and needs it on the
Yeah.
video. But if the video is not perfect, it's it's not something I'm linking on my website and it's within my lecture. So I can just do my best while I'm showing the video in class to kind
Yeah,
of describe what's happening.
absolutely. And I
Okay.
think that when you're kind of doing your own audio descriptions like that, um, keep it brief and just remember like it's nice because you can kind of describe it in a way that makes sure anyone who couldn't quite see it is caught up, but it also orients the people who could see it so it can be helpful for everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Lauren, you also have your hand up.
Yes. Let's figure out how to lower my hand. There we go. You might have said this earlier on, and I apologize, and I don't know if anyone
Okay.
else has this problem, but what about in terms of videos and images where you actually need students to visually identify stuff as part
Yeah,
of
that's a
the
great question, and I hadn't gone over it yet, so
okay.
it's good you asked. Okay. I always use, oh, all right, sorry. I got really excited about that question. I love alt text. It's fun. Um, Alt text should be replicating what you can get visually from the image, but it doesn't have to analyze it. So, for example, if it's a plant pathology course and I am taking a quiz and I see an image of a leaf, I can tell pretty quickly that leaf is not green, it's more brown and it has yellow spots. Like that's not an analysis. That's just kind of what I immediately see in the image. The actual, learning comes in when I'm able to tell you like what nutrient deficiency likely caused the leaf to look like that. So similarly, if you were writing alt text for that image on the quiz, you would say a leaf that again, this is not my subject matter expertise, but like a brown leaf with yellow spots. But you would not need to say, why it is that way. So the analysis is like, okay, I know what it looks like, and now I'm telling you why. Does that answer the question?
Slightly, but like I teach an imaging course for anatomy, and so
Mm.
this seems like this is more of a me question.
hmm
So maybe I'll email you and get some of your
Yeah,
feedback so you don't
if we
take all the
have
class
time
time. Okay.
after, ask me, and if not, email me because it might be helpful for me to see
Yeah.
examples and like workshop some alt text with you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So that was step 4. Step 5 can be a little controversial, but I promise it's because I'm trying to be nice to you. That's why I'm recommending this. And that is, I've been calling it ditch PDFs, create documents. I know that you will still be using PDFs, but PDF accessibility is difficult. I'm doing like a 1 hour webinar on it next week, and it's like just PDFs. So anytime you can find a way to use another file format instead of that PDF, you're saving yourself time later. So if you are sharing your PowerPoint slides, for example, and you've been exporting them to PDF, you might save yourself time by just sharing them as PowerPoints because PowerPoint accessibility is a little easier. Same with like Word documents that you created. If it's something that you didn't create, like a journal article, you might be able to find the DOI link, and then there's like the full HTML text version. You might also find a copy in the libraries, like on the library databases. So if you have like a PDF saved that you've been uploading to Canvas, you might want to see if the libraries have another version of it. And often the libraries will have an HTML version, but even if they're only giving a PDF version, um, it still kind of takes some pressure off of you because the libraries specify in their contracts with vendors that the material has to be accessible. And sometimes you'll go in and you'll notice, like, ooh, this should be accessible, but it's not. But then the libraries have the ability to go to the vendor and say, hey, you're not fulfilling your promise to us, instead of it being the instructor's job to remediate it because it was your own copy. So it kind of can like, instead of being alone with this PDF, you have like a team and you can like reach out to the vendor and ask for help. So step 5 is kind of to save yourself some time later by eliminating as many PDFs as you can so that any PDFs you're dealing with are definitely necessary. And then step 6, this one's actually my favorite. It's looking at your PowerPoints. PowerPoint has an accessibility checker. It's also in Word. And again, maybe I just have a really weird sense of fun, but I think that PowerPoint accessibility is genuinely enjoyable. Like it just tells you the issues and it lets you fix them right there. And it's just like really fast and easy. And then it's satisfying because at the end you have a bunch of check marks. So if you're sharing PowerPoints, this is a good stage to do it at, especially because PowerPoint accessibility is fun. And then you're kind of getting yourself emotionally ready for the next step, which is finding any PDFs you have left in your course and remediating them. Um, I have a resource slide at the end that has a couple of links that will be relevant. I won't be able to talk too much about PDF accessibility right now. And then the final step is just to plan for the future. Once your course content is accessible, unfortunately, then you're going to update it. You're going to teach a new course. You're going to create something new. So just kind of figure out how you're going to work it into your normal practices in the future. The initial push where you're remediating old content is harder than it will be in the future because once you're creating new content, you've already done a lot of work learning about how to make it accessible. So you'll do it as you go and it won't feel as difficult. Um, Eileen, I'm going to do one last slide and then I'm going to go back to your PDF question in the chat. But I didn't want you to think that I hadn't noticed it. So again, I can make sure that I share these slides with John so he can send them to you all. But these are just a lot of resources that I wanted to link you to. The first one is about PDF accessibility. UFIT made Adobe Acrobat Pro licenses available for free to faculty members through May 31st. So if you're faculty and you have PDFs to remediate, that article talks a little bit about what PDF accessibility is, and then has links on how to request the software and also training videos on PDFs. And then 8 steps for course accessibility are the steps that I've given you, but with like relevant links and like longer explanations. And then I have a longer webinar in case you want to go back and watch that. And then the rest are just kind of some various resources that I'll let you look through if you're interested in. And if you get really excited about accessibility, this last link is to our community of practice. It's a team on Teams where we chat about these things. And every other month, every 2 or 3 months, we'll have a meeting. I think we're having one more meeting before the deadlines. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And then, John, if you want, you can stop recording.